In this example, we're going to take a look at the equals local scope property and see how it can be used in a directive to do two-way type of binding. Now, the first thing I want to point out is the template's a little bit different here. You'll notice we're first off going to bind to a property called data source. We're going to be creating that. We're going to get to the name and the street. And then we're also going to have this button, which kind of wraps down so you can see everything. And when we click it, it's going to update the data source's name. Now, normally I don't like to embed that. I'd prefer to use a controller, and we'll talk about controllers later in the course, but for this demonstration, it'll provide an easy way to show this two-way data binding. So the first thing we need is we need the local scope property. So I'm going to come in and make a scope property like we've been doing. We'll cut ourselves off from the outside world here, but then we'll come in and we'll do data source, and then colon, I'm going to do equals. Now, I like to think of the equals as if you're driving down the street, at least in the United States here, an equals is kind of a two-way highway line that we use, and a lot of other countries use it as well. But I like to think of it that way. I like to think of traffic goes both ways. You can't pass, but traffic goes both ways with this. And that's one way I kind of memorize what the equals is. Now, to prove this is going to work, what we're going to do is bind the customer property that you saw way back in the little controller that we have right here. And we want to bind David and the street, the name and the street in. To do that, though, we're going to do it in a two-way data binding technique, and we're not going to pass a string. We're going to pass an object. So let's go back over to here, and let's go ahead and add a new section for this. So we'll do isolate scope with object. And then we'll go ahead and put the tag in here real quick. So isolate scope with object. So tip number one, don't make your directive names too long. You can see what happens, but let's come on in. We'll do data source. Now I'm going to bind to customer. Now note, no squiggly brackets. On this one, you just put the binding that you want to do. It's kind of like using ng model if you use that much. Very, very similar. So now the whole customer object gets passed in. Now the directive itself does assume that whatever you're going to pass in has a name and a street property. Now this is actually very common. A lot of times when you make this type of a directive, you'll have some documentation that says, hey, whatever data source you pass me must have these, characteristics. If you've ever done a jQuery plugin, for instance, then that's very common that you have to pass in certain types of setting properties, for instance. So pretty common. Now, when we click the button, though, we're going to change the data source's name from, I believe it's David right now, to Fred. And let's see what happens here. So we now have our HTML in. Let's reference the script, and I think we're ready to go. So we'll go ahead and add our source. Brackets, as you can see, makes it really easy to select the actual script. Okay, so we now have our isolate scope with object being passed in. It's going to be a two-way binding. Data source is our property. It's an equals local scope property, and we're binding to customer, which comes from this controller here. So let me go ahead, and I already have the web page up and loaded. So let's refresh it here, and there we go. You'll see that we did get David and the street value. Now, if I hit change, it should change the data source's name property to Fred. Well, let's see what happens here. Oh, it did, but look what it also changed. Now remember, this is a two-way binding. So by setting up an equals, if I change a value on the customer, then that actually flows back out into whoever passed it in this case, the parent scope, and it updates that as well. And that's why Fred updated here and here, because we're touching the same object and we're updating the same object. So that's really the big difference with the equals versus the at, is the at is a one-way, the equals is a two-way. And this provides some pretty powerful features, because now you can have a directive that might manipulate some data. Maybe it does some custom sorting, and then the outer object that was passed in originally to this property here would also get sorted, or whatever it was you did to it. So there's a lot of interesting things you can do with it. So we now have seen two ways we can get data in and kind of through the wall. But there's one more I'm going to show you, and that's going to be coming up next.